everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every week, photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. And if you'd like to join us live, you'll find the schedule for upcoming sessions on my website at lindanickell.com. Every week, my guests share their photography tips and insight into their creative journeys, and they inspire us to look at a subject a little differently. Tonight's guest is Dan Walters. Dan is a Colorado-based wildlife photographer and photography workshop instructor. A few of his clients and publication credits include Audubon Magazine, Colorado Outdoors, Bugle Magazine, and the Humane Society. In tonight's presentation, Dynamic Bird Photography. Dan will talk about camera settings, how to use light to your advantage, and understanding bird behavior. By combining all of these elements, your bird photography will stand out. If you'd like to join Dan in the field, you can find more about his upcoming workshops on his website at danwaltersphoto.com. And if you're on Instagram, you can follow him at danwall2. And I'll link his information in the show notes. So with that, welcome to the Happiness Hour, Dan.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you for everyone for joining too. Just a little bit about myself. I'm in Lakewood, Colorado. I started in with wildlife photography and kind of gravitated to mostly birds now because the variety of birds that are out there, and being in Colorado, you have so many different types of birds that migrate in and out during the spring and the wintertime. And it's just a lot of fun. There's just so much activity and so many different behaviors you can photograph. I'm just addicted to it. So I do lead some workshops in Florida during Florida's Birding and Photo Fest in St. Augustine, which is a lot of fun. And I've also teamed up with Lisa Langell for her Magic of Alaska. And we're also going to be in Bosque in January. So I'm really looking forward to that. So on that note, let me go ahead. I'm going to share my screen and I will get started. Talk about is how to capture some dynamic bird images. So the first thing, what you want to do is concentrate on behavior. So when you show some behavior in your bird images, it helps tell a story. So for example, I photographed these royal terns in St. Augustine, Florida. And what the male will do, he'll come in with a fish and present it to the female. As if she accepts that fish, the birds will mate. Now, one thing is important here is you want to create enough space so you don't clip these wings. So it's important to take a step back. So if you have a zoom lens, zoom out a little bit so you get the full wings and the behavior and all that stuff in your image. If you have a fixed lens, take about 20 steps back. That way you don't clip anything. You can always crop in if you're a little too far. Another really nice bird I like to photograph are American avocets. Every spring we get these birds that come in and they perform a beautiful mating ritual. So you have the male right here. The female puts her head down and the male will splash water on each side of her neck. He mounts her and then they do this beautiful dance. So this is another one I got here just at sunrise. So you have that nice warm light that really helps illuminate the bird, especially with their breeding colors. You get some nice reflections. So I didn't want to get too close and scare the birds off. And also I didn't want to clip these wings as well, because once they get on the back of the female, they like to extend those wings. So you have to be careful about, not getting too close. And a lot of this is just understanding the behavior of your subject. In the wintertime, we get a lot of migrating ducks that come in. Common golden eyes, hooded mergansers, canvasbacks. And later in the wintertime, they perform their mating rituals. So here we have a common golden eye. And what they'll do to attract the female, they make this little croak bend the head back, and then start splashing the water. So again, don't get too close because you want to include that splash. And also, you need to watch your exposure too for these birds. You get this bright white here and the dark heads. So what I usually like to do is expose for the whites, and that way I don't overblow them, or blow those whites out. Now, another thing too with the newer cameras, you also have that built-in live histogram. So it makes it nice and easy to make sure you're not clipping your whites or clipping your shadows as well. And also with the lower light too, with the angle of the head, that's another thing to watch for, is a certain angle that sun will help light up those greens in that head and also bring out that yellow in the eyes too. Otherwise, if the head's angled at a different direction just a little bit, it's a lot more darker. Now, red-winged blackbirds, those are really fun to photograph too. During the springtime, they'll migrate into Colorado, and the males will establish their territories by their song that they sing. So they're establishing territories before the females get there. So here, this was late evening, and that low light helps illuminate all that nice detail in the feathers. If the sun was just a little bit higher, all that feather detail would be lost. And also you have some of the reeds in the background, so it gives a sense of place as well too. And what you want to do is watch your exposure too. One trick I do is with that warm light and these bright reds, I will actually lower the color temperature just a little bit so you don't blow out those reds. Otherwise, you would have to underexpose so much to save those reds. By the time you open everything up, you'd have so much noise. So try lowering that temperature to, let's say, 5,000 or 5,000 or 4,500. It'll be a little cooler, but you can always warm that up in post-processing, and you'll save those reds as well too. Another bird I love photographing in the wintertime are hooded mergansers. And one of their favorite little meals are crayfish. So they'll dive under the water, catch the crayfish, and shake it until those front claws fall off. So the thing is, though, you got to keep your head on a swivel because you don't know where they're going to pop up. I was fortunate here that this one popped up right in front of me in some nice morning light. And you can see right here, this crayfish has some eggs in there too. So that kind of adds to the drama of the image as well. And with these birds too, I have to get down low, so at a lower level, and you get better eye contact with them as well too. Interaction between the chicks are nice too, and the parent. This was taken at St. Augustine Alligator Farm. And that is an amazing place if you've ever been there. You have so many birds in one spot. You have nesting birds that are just everywhere. You walk along a boardwalk, the gators are below, and you have birds just nesting in the trees. So it's an outdoor rookery, and they use that to their advantage because the alligators will keep predators away from the nest. So that's why they nest there. But they have to be careful when they're in the water collecting sticks because the gators will try to get them. But capturing that interaction between the chicks and the parent helps tell a story too. Now, smaller egrets that we get the black-crowned night herons and the snowy egrets here. One trick that they do to attract fish is they'll vibrate that bill in the water, and that usually attracts the fish. So here I opened up wide open just to have the head in focus and everything kind of fall out of focus. That way there's more emphasis on the eyes too. And using your aperture and your shutter speed and everything like that, your ISO are just tools to help you create the image you want. If you want a more depth of field, you stop down to f8 or f11. But here I chose to open up just to get just a little bit of depth of field just in the eyes and let everything else go out of focus. We also get a lot of American white pelicans. And by understanding their behavior, you can catch some images too. So, for example, these birds, they'll sit and preen forever. But once they're done preening, they often do a head stretch or a neck stretch or pouch stretch. So, if you can anticipate that, switch to a vertical format, scoot back a little bit, depending on how close you are, so you can get the whole bill in there too. And it's interesting in the springtime, the males and the females would get these breeding horns that fall off after the breeding season. So, and each one is a little bit different. They're like little fingerprints. So each one is kind of, you get some nice little variations in here. Others are little bumps. So it's just kind of neat to see the different variety of breeding horns that are on these birds. Here's another preening one. Ducks will often do a wing flap after they're done preening. So again, scoot back a little bit. So that way you get the whole wing in there and all the droplets of water around the duck too. This was taken a little bit overcast, which is kind of nice because when they rear up like this, if the light's too harsh, you're going to blow out those whites. So that's something to watch for too, is get your exposure and expose for something that's kind of white. So that way, when they do that, you don't overblow your highlights. And expect the unexpected. We had a snow day, and I went to a local park and photographed this red-tailed hawk. It was a young red-tailed hawk, and he was just sitting in the tree. So I was just kind of waiting for him to do something. Well, a little bit of snow fell from one of the top branches, and it scared the hawk. So he attacked the tree. So you get this nice little sequence of events which helps tell a story. It's kind of funny, and it's just something a little bit different too. Here, I shot wide open because there were so many trees. I wanted to blow those branches out as much as possible. That way they're not that distracting. Breeding colors are neat to capture in the springtime. You'll get the avocets with that golden brown color. You'll get the great egrets. They'll get that skin patch that's nice and green and those red eyes. And the tricolor herons too. They'll get that beautiful bluish color with those red eyes. And they'll often do a little mating ritual where they bob their head up and down. So that's something to watch for and capture that, because all that behavior, the breeding colors, everything just adds to the story. Lighting is really important too. If the light was a little higher, bald eagles are very hard to expose for because those whites are bright white and that body is so dark. Here, the sun was just coming up. It helped make the exposure just a little bit easier. And all those wings were both wings, obviously, were lit up because of that low light. As the sun gets higher and you're trying to photograph birds in flight, those wings get those shadows underneath. So that's why that early morning or late evening is the best time to photograph flying birds. That low light, like I said, with the avocets, really helps bring out the color of that bird too. And watch the reflections too in the water. That can add a nice splash of color too. So, and here's, the reflection too. You want to get back a little bit to include that whole reflection. This was a great horned owlet in late evening as the sun was going down. It really helped illuminate the eyes and brought some nice warm colors to the bird too. Also, later or earlier in the day too, you would get shadows right here under the eye. So as the sun gets lower, it really helps illuminate those eyes too. That way you don't get that shadow. And also you get some shadows in the background too, which is nice. So it helps the owl stand out. Silhouettes are really nice too. As the sun was starting to set, this was in Yellowstone. I exposed for the brightest part of the cloud and set my exposure to that. That way, as the pelican flew across, he was a nice silhouette, and you had some nice color and detail in the clouds without blowing that out. Otherwise, if you would expose for the pelican, you would add detail in the pelican, but you would have lost all this in the background. This was in Florida as well as at sunrise. So at low tide, all that wet sand reflects the color of the sky. So again, expose for that sand, expose for this area here, and let your birds go dark. I like trying to get some low-key images as well, too. So in that sense, you'll have the bird lit up against a darker background. So when you expose for these light areas here, all this goes nice and dark, and it really helps create more of a dynamic image. It's just, and that's why I always like going to local parks over and over again, because you know where the best locations are in that park. So that way you can anticipate where some of those birds are going to end up. This was a snowy egret feeding at one of my local parks again, and he was lit up. The background was in shadow. So by exposing for the whites, I have nice detail in the whites, and the shadows go nice and dark. This is one of my favorite photo situations, where you have that dark background and the light bird. It just helps everything stand out just a little bit more. High key images are very fun to shoot too. So on those cloudy days, I'll often take a reading off the cloudy sky and open up maybe one or two stops. That way that sky goes completely white. Otherwise, what your camera meter wants to do is meter off that sky and put it right in the middle, so you have a dark gray sky. So you have to tell the meter, I don't want to do that. I want to create a high key image. That's why you overexpose a little bit too. That way you also get some nice detail in these young hawks as well too, as it flew across the sky. There's some great blue herons having a disagreement. Again, I took a reading off the sky, overexposed, and it helps simplify the image as well too. Okay, this is another one where, oh, did I skip? No, I didn't. Where I wanted to include more reflections. So by scooting back a little bit, as this egret was, what these egrets do is they'll chase other egrets away. So he was in the act of chasing off another egret. So when he got ready to fly, he spread those wings out. So I wanted to include that whole reflection. So this was taken with a zoom lens. So I zoomed out a little bit so I can get that whole reflection. I like to include a lot of reflections, and especially with birds in water. So this was at a local pond. We get a group of wood ducks every fall, and we have some trees that change in the back, and in the morning you get these beautiful reflections. So what you do is just kind of hunker down and just wait for these ducks to fly in front of, or swim in front of that reflection. That way you get some nice color, some really nice light, and it just helps create a dynamic image. And this was the egret I was telling you about too. It's scooting back, keeping that reflection in the image. Now, manual metering, I often shoot in just manual. So I shoot manual and manual ISO too. So the reason I like to do that, especially with egrets, is they're so active. They run around everywhere. And if they run in front of a dark background or a white background, and you're shooting in maybe shutter or aperture priority, sometimes that meter is going to pick up on that white or dark background and change your exposure. So by shooting in manual, you will keep the exposure the same on the bird no matter what background what background it runs in front of. Now, of course, it has to stay in the same light. Once it goes into the shadow area, a shadowy area, I'll either wait for the bird to come back into the light, but if it's doing something interesting, I'll just raise the ISO 1 or 2 stops. That way, your image won't be too dark. Now, birds in flight, that's one of my favorite things to photograph, especially when they're landing. So you get the feet outstretched, you get the wings, flaring out. So that's one of my favorite things to capture. And in that low light situation like that too, you're going to get no shadow underneath the wings and just some really nice detail in there. Okay, when shooting birds in flight, when they're flying parallel, I like to have the wings down or up. That way, if they're parallel, it looks like just a real skinny bird. But having the wings down, you get some nice detail in there as well. And sometimes having the wings up is nice too, because it shows the whole body, shows the feet, and also shows this nice branch here too. This was a black-crowned night heron. We get a group of them every year around Washington Park in Denver, and they nest in that area. And every morning you can go down there and they're flying back and forth with different sticks and twigs and stuff like that. So it's just another nice behavior image you can capture as well. Oh, geez, turn that off. This is another one, a great blue heron in early morning light. Really helps light up the wings. It's got nesting material right here. And it's just another behavior image. Sometimes getting those capturing birds when they collect nesting material just adds a little story to the image, and it just helps tell a story and creates a lot of interest in the image. This was an osprey flying. There's 2 different examples here. So I got the osprey flying in low light, with the wings all lit up, but as the sun gets a little higher, that's when you get those shadows. So that's something to watch for when you're photographing these birds flying around. Once you start to see the shadows, might be time to, unless it's doing something really interesting, or they're landing parallel with the wings outstretched, you'll get the wings lit up. Now, different shutter speeds. I like to shoot these birds, most birds in flight, at around 25th hundredth of a second or 32 hundredths of a second. That way you capture some nice sharp images. For example, with the flying ducks, they're really fast, especially those hooded mergansers. I like to shoot at least 25th hundredth of a second, if not higher. Here I had a young red-tailed hawk fly at me at 2,000ths of a second, so that kind of helped freeze the action. Bigger birds, when they come in, I can get away with even as low as 1/500th of a second, because they usually fly pretty slow. Now, these barn swallows, that's a whole other story. I like to keep it at least 4,000ths of a second because they are very fast. Now, with a lot of the cameras nowadays, with the eye focus, what I'll do is I'll switch to a large zone focus. That way, that eye focus won't get that eye. You'll lose it real fast. But the large zone focus, you'll have a clump of autofocus points that'll stick on the bird and help to get more of those sharp. Bigger birds, when they're flying really close, I use that eye focus. But sometimes that zone focus, I think, works just a little bit better. Now, I'm shooting with the R6, so some different camera bodies might have different focusing modes you can use, but they're fun to try out and play with and see which one works best for you. Now, weather can add some life to your images as well, too. This was a snowshoe trip up to Guanella Pass, and it really wasn't snowing. We just had gusts of wind that would blow the snow around the ptarmigan. Now, when you're shooting white birds in snow, what I'll do is take a meter reading off that snow and overexpose a little bit, because again, your camera meter wants to make everything gray. So overexposing helps you bring some nice white areas, but you have to be careful not to overexpose. That's why it's so nice on some of these newer cameras. They have that live histogram. You can watch that. So it makes it easy to expose for your images without blowing out your highlights. This is a grumpy wood duck. This was a spring storm in Colorado, a late spring storm. And I think he was ready for spring because he does not look happy. So I chose a nice close crop just to emphasize that snow on the head and just emphasize that brings out that look too. You could tell he's not very happy. Now, photographing birds while it's snowing is a challenge in itself. So what I'll do is lower my autofocus sensitivity so it doesn't pick up the snowflakes. That way, once it's locked in on the bird, it stays locked in. Otherwise, if your sensitivity is too high, it might try to pick up some of these snowflakes. So you'll have a group of images where the bird's sharp, and then other ones where you have some sharp snowflakes. I like those windy days, especially when photographing snowy egrets, because that wind really blows these plumes around. And you could tell this was in the breeding season too, because that yellow is now more of a magenta color. When shooting smaller birds, I like to get down as low as possible. That way you get a more intimate image and you get better eye contact. And this is another one where, I had to go back a little bit so I wouldn't cut that reflection off. Another thing I like to do is get that raised foot. It just adds just a little interest to the image. If it was just both feet on the ground, it wouldn't have that bit of energy it has with the raised foot. Now, depth of field and background is kind of important too. On this one, I stopped down to f8 just because two things. I wanted to make sure I got all the blue heron in focus because I was pretty close to him. And I also wanted to show a little bit of texture in the background. Now, if you would have opened up all the way, you would have this nice clean background too. So it's just depending on what type of image you want to create. Having those fall colors in the background too can help add a nice splash of image. Here I photographed this red-tailed hawk as it was taking off in front of these fall trees. So it added a nice splash of color, and you can see some of the detail in the trees as well too. Now, show shutters are a lot of fun too. I photographed this at 1/10 of a second. That way you get some nice blurs in the wings without having it too abstract where you couldn't tell what it was. And you have some nice streaks of color in the background too. This was taken almost around probably 9 o'clock, where it was almost too bright to shoot. So I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to try some blurs just to see how they turn out. So this is 1/20th of a second, and I lowered the ISO to ISO 50 and f32, and you get a bunch of nice little blurs in here, but you can still tell what the bird is. And it's just fun just playing around with different shutter speeds, and different shutter speeds can create different results. This was in Bosque. A group of snow geese were flying in, and that sky has that nice pink color to it. And this is a little more abstract because you can kind of tell they're geese, but not quite. But it just kind of helps create an interest in just a whole different type of image too. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the the technical stuff here, but we got it done. And I'm at Instagram at danwal2, Facebook Dan.Walters1, and danwaltersphoto.com.
There was one question in here, and
Sure.
I can find it. It was from John, and his question. I think you made a reference to color temperature settings.
Right.
John's question is: I thought camera color temperature settings wasn't an impact on raw data. Maybe some cameras do. Do you have an answer for that?
Well, I just have noticed it's just something I played around with, and just by just kind of in that situation, usually I have a warmer temperature on. I kind of like that warm
Hmm.
tone to my images. But in that situation, I found it was blowing out those reds. So I did a little reading and I found an article and probably a couple of years ago, Outdoor Photographer magazine when it was still around. I don't even know if it's still around anymore, but someone had mentioned to lower that color temperature to, to 4,500 or 5,000. And I tried it and it seemed to work. And I saved the details in there because with the histogram too, you can not only you can look at the color histogram too and see if you're blowing out those reds. And I found that by lowering that temperature a little bit, I was saving those reds so I wouldn't blow them out. Because when I got home after I shot it just at a normal temperature, those reds were just like, I can't save these reds, you know? So the only, what you can do is just underexpose so much, but by the time you underexpose and then try to open it up again, that's when you introduce all that noise. So that's why they always say kind of expose to the right as much as possible. That way you get more of a dynamic image.
Yep. I do not disagree with you. All right, wait a minute. Yes, I think I agree with you, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so I was floating through and I cannot find any questions in here because there are so many really nice comments in here for you, Dan. And I'll share
Oh,
this.
thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's all about the diversity of birds that you were
Right.
able to show. Were most of those, a good percentage of them coming from home base for you,
Uh,
or
Most
your,
of them are. It's like there's a local pond I go to. It's just like 3 miles away, and every season there's something different there. It's like what was it? Last spring we had a spring snowstorm, and I went out because I wanted to photograph snowy egrets in snow, which I did get some images of that. That just I've always wanted to do that, and I finally had the opportunity. And as I was walking out of the park, I see something big flying in, and it's a great egret. And he's landing in a snowy tree, and he had the green eye patch or the green patch of skin, which is totally something unusual. As usually I photograph those in Florida, in the green trees and everything, but landing in a snowy tree was something completely different. But yeah, in the wintertime at that same pond, we get all the winter ducks that come in. So you get hooded mergansers, you get canvasbacks, you get redheads, all kinds of stuff. And every once in a while, in the wintertime too, we get an influx of bald eagles from Canada. So we have a lot of bald eagles here.
very cool. Yeah, I don't know how to say it. Merganza, is that what you're saying? I'm not
Merganser.
sure. I
Yeah, the
want
hooded
one of
mergansers.
those
They're
guys.
they're little
Yeah,
speed demons when they fly.
I think all waterfowl is for me. They're
Yeah,
too
they
fast.
are. They're fast.
And I appreciate that you agree that the barn swallows are fast because I can't seem to catch them either.
I only get a
Really,
little handful of those every now and then. They're
they're
tough, but it's a fun challenge. I mean, you get yourself out there, and pretty soon it's like, man, I've been out here 2 hours, and it's like, oh my God, look at all these images I have to go through now. Because nowadays the cameras, some of the higher end models are what 120 frames a second, which is bonkers.
crazy. The editing on that would be crazy. Just culling through all those photos would drive me crazy. So, we
Sometimes you get a whole bunch.
yeah, we want the technology, but then when you're home alone at 11 o'clock at night trying to sort
Right.
through, it's not as
Yeah.
fun.
Right.
Well, thank you for accepting my invitation to come and um talk to the group. And I know you didn't know me. I actually I was trying to remember because sometimes I can't remember how I find somebody, and
Right.
for whatever
I think you
reason
found me on Instagram.
I found you on Instagram. That's where I live, by the way. But yeah, I found you on Instagram. It was one of those random photos that came into my feed, and then I go down a little rabbit hole, and then I get to your website and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to ask. So thank you for
Oh
giving
no,
a
thank you. I appreciate it.
yeah. So all right, next week Trish Ziegler will be here to share her presentation, Postcards from the Back Roads. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful, and I hope that we see you again soon.